What's up, guys? You're now listening to Devo with Uncle Theo. Today is day 281, and we're going to cover Matthew chapters 18 through 20. Last time we left off, we saw the withdrawal of the king, and in chapter 17, we saw the transfiguration, which was a beautiful moment that encapsulated so much Old Testament theology in one chapter. And today we pick up in chapter 18, where Jesus continues this third teaching block, and he teaches on humility. It says, at that time the disciples came to Jesus and said, "Who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And he called a child to himself and set him before them and said, "Truly I say to you, unless you are converted and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever then humbles himself as a child, he is greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for him to have a heavy millstone hung around his neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea." And after that, we get the parable of the lost sheep. And then we pick up on how to handle offenses. And most people in the church have termed this the section on church discipline. I really don't like that word. I prefer the word church restoration, because the goal isn't really to discipline somebody out of the church. It's to restore them and win them back. They have to discipline themselves out of the church by not repenting. But I would say that you should be a part of a church that practice this, because that would be a big indicator on whether your church takes sin seriously. And another thing that I like to note this on how to handle offenses, you're cornered in. In Matthew 5, it says that if your brother has something against you, leave your gift at the altar and go reconcile and make that issue right. But here, it's if you have something against your brother, if you've seen your brother sin, it's basically a 4-step process here. It's one, you're to show him his fault privately, and Lord willing, most offenses end there. But if that doesn't work, step 2 is you're to take 1 or 2 more with you. And this is an overlap of the principle in the Mosaic law in Deuteronomy 19:15. And if you're not successful there, and step 3 is you're to tell it to the church. And then if you're not successful there, then you're to treat that person as an unbeliever. And when we get to 1 Corinthians 5, actually, we'll see this even more in depth. Paul gives us some more light on an issue in the church that he says should be church discipline. And so we'll talk about that when we get there. Then Jesus gives his last teaching in this third block, and he teaches on forgiveness. This is where that famous 70 times 7 is, and we have the parable of the king who forgives the debts of his slaves. And then at the end of this chapter, we enter our 4th block, and this is our 4th bridge. Remember the statement? Look at chapter 19. When Jesus had finished these words, and now we're about to move in the narrative. Remember? Narrative, then teaching. Then we'll get that statement. After Jesus had finished these words, narrative and teaching, then we'll get that statement. And this is the 4th time we've seen that. And so remember, there's 5 blocks of this, and we're entering the 4th here. And Jesus is going to instruct on divorce. And I can't cover this here, but I would say to you to make sure you understand Jesus' teaching on divorce, because you'll deal with this in your life. Someone's going to come to you and ask if they have grounds for divorce when they're not happy, or when they're struggling, or they're going through something. And you need to be well studied on this issue, on how you would counsel that individual on whether or not Jesus would permit a divorce in those circumstances. And so you have 3 views. You have what's called a permanence view, where there's no divorce under any circumstances. You have the conservative view, where there's divorce under 2 circumstances, and remarriage under 3, which is adultery, the unbeliever departing, and obviously remarriage under the 3rd one, which is becoming a widow, being able to remarry there. And then you have various positions of liberal views that you can divorce and remarry for several other reasons. And again, I can't go deep, for the nature of this podcast is mainly reading strategy and survey material, but I must exhort you to make sure you have a biblical position there and you can defend your position from scripture, so that you can lovingly shepherd people who will go through this. Unfortunately, the divorce rate in the church is just as great as it is in the world. And so you will deal with this if you have not already. Chapter 19 wraps up with the story of the rich young ruler and the apostles' reward. Then we move into chapter 20 with the parable of the laborers, and Jesus getting more and more precise about the instruction of his death. Let's read this as we close out. It says in chapter 20, verse 17, as Jesus was about to go up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside by themselves, and on the way he said to them, Behold, we are moving up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death, and will hand him over to the Gentiles and mock and scourge and crucify him. And on the third day, he will be raised up. And then as we end, Jesus heals 2 blind men. And we talked about this before, about harmonization. This happened with the centurion. Matthew speaks as if the centurion was speaking with Jesus, but Luke records his record stating that the centurion had sent Jewish elders. And so this is an example of, okay, you have 2 different accounts. How do you harmonize this? Because you know there aren't contradicting. Luke chose his material to argue a certain point. He wanted to argue Jesus' humanity, and Matthew is arguing Jesus' kingship. And so when you have different accounts, you have to harmonize those to put the pieces together to figure out what actually happened. And so when you're studying ancient literature with the centurion, sending someone was just like you going. And so that language is used there in the text. But we have that again here as we close out. The blind man recognized Jesus as king. And there's a tie here to David as well, where he says, have mercy on the son of David. But I want you to see it says here that 2 blind men were sitting on the road. But Mark and Luke mention only 1 blind man. And so how do you reconcile that? We'll see this with the demoniac as well. Well, you reconcile this with Matthew is giving an account of both of the men who were there, but Luke and Mark are emphasizing the actual spokesperson. So it's really not hard to harmonize. There's always a conservative position when you work through these texts. But I bring this up because these are the things that skeptics and unbelievers are going to bring up to trip you up. And I want you to know about them beforehand so you can be ready to give enough defense for your faith, because these are the things that people use to trip believers up, to get them to weaken their faith. And these arrows can be impactful, but they shouldn't be, because you and I are on a goal of mastery of the scripture, and we want to identify things like this and be able to harmonize. So don't let anybody damage your faith by telling you there are inconsistencies. Trust me, there's always an answer, and not one of acrobatics or gymnastics. I mean, there's always a conservative answer. And so we're going to wrap up here in chapter 20. And tomorrow we're going to get the official rejection of the king during his triumphal entry. Catch you on tomorrow. You guys take care and have a good day.